Chapter 10 of Homesick, The Hobbit fanfiction, written by Margot_Kim, read aloud by SkyAsimaru. If you enjoy this podfic, you can check out the original story on Archive of Our Own. If you would like to hear more of my recordings or see some of my own work, you can find me through the pen and screen name of SkyAsimaru. Homesick, Chapter 10. Once upon a time, for that was the proper start to these sort of things, there was an exile who lived to crown himself king. But that is not really the beginning of a story. In stories, the kinds of stories that start with such phrases as "once upon a time," you're lucky to see the man arise a king with enough pages left over for him to actually sit down on the throne. The crowning is the end of matters. No one tells tales of proper waste management legislation. Which was why Thorin was convinced that the bards of Erebor were disappointed he hadn't managed to get himself killed in some properly tragic way. His continued existence was hell on their dramatic arcs. So here's a story, a new one for them, to tell in Thorin's absence from the mountain. Once upon a time, there was a king who lived to name himself Exiled. And he exiled himself for love, of course, which was nearly as good for drama as tragedy was. And the two were admittedly nigh inseparable. The love of a stranger from a strange land. There's a reason to exile yourself. You hardly need to name the lesser causes that he might prefer the bards keep to themselves. Weariness, Thorin thought very privately, was such a very private thing. In fleeing, he had confessed it to too many people already, and some nights in the Eyrie, he lay tormented by the guilt that Bilbo's illness had perhaps been nothing but a cover for him, a clause of plausible deniability for why he could not wear the crown a moment longer. That the true reason that he had left was nothing more dramatic than that after a century of trying to get home, 5 years of trying to rule it had proved too exhausting to sustain. That he had wanted something and gotten it, and then found himself surprised when he discovered that having gotten it, he was now expected to keep it. What if Bilbo had never gotten sick? Thorin would lie awake and ask himself again and again and again, the way you do when the night is quiet and the eagles are abed, and you've nothing to do but think. What would Thorin had done then? Would he have still fled in the night? Perhaps, he thought. Perhaps, but Bilbo would have fled alongside him, running on his own 2 legs, and they would have run for nothing more than the pleasure of leaving, not because death was snapping at their heels, with Thorin running, flying to save what in this world was most worth saving. And terror at this point typically devoured guilt whole, and Thorin would spend the rest of the night picturing Bilbo as he had left him in his garden in the dead of night, arranged with what quick dignity Thorin could give him, and with a letter too hastily written tucked in his pocket. And then, in Thorin's memory, Bilbo stayed still, but grew smaller as the eagle that had delivered him home rose up with Thorin clinging to his back. Thorin had expected Bilbo to awaken the moment he touched the soil of the Shire. Thorin had thought he would at least get to tell Bilbo goodbye in person as Bilbo awoke from his long dreams. But Bilbo had rested unchanged upon the ground, and as Thorin took off, he realized that Thranduil's words had all been lies. Or they had all been true, but Thorin was too late. Or that Bilbo had died on the journey, and no one he had met had had the heart to tell Thorin. And then Bilbo was gone, and the world was sky. The land turned to winter, and winter lengthened the nights until each one stretched like a year. And Thorin spent the years sleepless in the eyrie of the great eagles. He fingered Bilbo's wedding ring like a talisman, taken from Bilbo's too still and too cold hand. Thorin had traded Bilbo's body for it, taking the ring and giving the bead the raven had returned to him, had spat out in Thorin's hand along with the eagle's second rejection. Thorin had been passing through Beorn's lands when the raven had brought him this refusal, alone and without companion, except for Bilbo's quiet sleeping body on his back. The raven had waited. Thorin had offered him the only thing left that he could think to offer. And the raven had returned with the king of all birds himself, who asked Thorin why he kept bothering them. "Bring him home," Thorin had begged the king, begged as he had never once begged in all his previous exile. And when begging did nothing, Thorin, who was no longer a king, did what he did best as a wandering craftsman. He bargained. "You have done well," the king of all birds told Thorin on his final day with them. It was the first time in his entire stay that he had offered Thorin a compliment, or indeed any indication that he did more than begrudgingly tolerate Thorin's uselessly bipedal figure skittering through his domain. But the king of all birds was still a king, and after 5 years on the throne himself, Thorin was not ignorant about what it took to bribe kings. No bird had ever worn a crown before, as Thorin had pointed out several months ago, and no king had ever, by another king, had his crown crafted. As far as prestige went, Thorin humbly suggested, the opportunity couldn't be beat. The birds had demanded Thorin craft the crown from their own materials in their own land. And so Thorin spent his winter single-handedly inventing metallurgy in the eyrie. If he hadn't been needing to get somewhere else, to put the problem mildly, Thorin might have relished the challenge of introducing beings without hands to millennia of artisanal skill. As it was, he was delirious with joy just to be finished with the damn thing. "Once upon a time," Thorin thought as the king of all birds preened with his new crown in the reflection of a mirror Thorin had built for just this purpose. "There was a dwarf who loved a hobbit.
and his life only got stranger from there.
"You have done very well," the king of all birds said, in the tones of a monarch who had just realized why those other mad tyrants locked their best craftsmen away to ensure the non-competing clause in their contract.
"I have done as I said I would,"
Thorin said.
"Will you do as you said you would?"
"Return you to the land of the halflings?" The king cocked his head, his gaze still fixed upon the mirror, as though he could not believe that the creature he beheld was himself.
"But why to such a place? Would the king of Erebor not rather return to Erebor?" "No."
Thorin hesitated, and then said the sentence he had been worrying over in his mouth and in his sleepless bed all his months at the Eyrie.
"I would rather go home."
The king of all birds shifted his gaze in the mirror from his own face to Thorin's.
"We carried you dying towards Erebor twice,"
he said, with as much of an arched eyebrow as an eagle could manage.
"If you didn't want to go there, you could have said so and saved us considerable effort."
Thorin was not convinced that picking up his ragdoll body from first the Misty Mountains and then Ravenhill had taken any particular effort at all. But he decided to keep that thought to himself.
"At the time I wanted Erebor. Now my home is somewhere else."
"Why?" Thorin hesitated, and then he said,
"Because my home is with the one I love most, and because I am tired of being king under the mountain."
The king of all birds clacked his beak approvingly.
Yes, that makes perfect sense,"
he said, which had not quite been the answer Thorin had been expecting.
"I never understood why you lot wanted to live under the mountain in the first place. Horrifying place. It makes my feathers ruffle just thinking about it. Very well then, former king, ex-king, the no more king under nothing but the sky. Let us end your deal with the eagles. We delivered your hobbit on faith. Now for this crown we shall take you home."
Thorin rode on the back of the king himself, his hands around the king's great throat as they soared up to meet the sky. And as the great bird turned west towards the rising moon, Thorin thought for the first time the thought that would come to beat inside him like a drum, or a heartbeat, or someone else's heartbeat.
"I will never see Erebor again."
And the king took him home. Thorin had thought Bilbo a ghost. He had hoped Bilbo a hallucination. A ghost would mean that the unthinkable had happened, and a hallucination would mean nothing more than Thorin had dreamt of Bilbo so long and with such longing that his dreams had begun to walk in the daylight hours.
"You look horrible,"
his hallucination said. And then Thorin's arms were filled by the one he loved. And there was Bilbo, warm and solid and alive. How long did they embrace? Thorin couldn't tell you, couldn't even think to guess. For who could say when the embrace even ended? Bilbo would pull back enough to look up at Thorin's face before he buried himself once more in Thorin's chest and Thorin buried himself in Bilbo's hair, as if they were both each other's sweet graves. Bilbo smelled as he never had in Erebor. A new musk, a new sweat. The last time Thorin had smelled Bilbo, he had smelled death. And so Thorin breathed deep the new sweetness. The smell was new and familiar. As Thorin smelled it for the first time, he realized how sorely he had missed it.
"Oh, Thorin!"
Bilbo exhaled, his words spoken against Thorin's heart.
"Thorin, my love, my husband, my Thorin!"
"Bilbo," Thorin breathed, and Bilbo pulled himself closer, and Thorin embraced him tighter. They might have been trying to become one person in the oldest way possible. It was an instinct that Thorin could never have defeated. A new form of gold sickness that was no sickness at all. Take what you love, pull him close, keep him safe. It was a little after 10 in the morning on a Tuesday when Bilbo kicked Thorin out of Bag End. By this point in the day, Thorin had been awake for 5 hours, entirely out of habit, although he'd stayed in bed on principle until the more leisurely hour of 7 o'clock. Thorin was trying his best to learn how to sleep in. He had once even managed to remain under the covers until the unbearably decadent time of noon, though he had been so overwrought about his indulgent indolence for the rest of the day that Bilbo had suggested that if Thorin did not enjoy sleeping in, he was under no actual obligation to do so. But Thorin was trying, and he was proud of himself this morning for getting up after the sun did. Living in Bag End was almost like slipping back into Erebor time, a chronology measured not by the rising and setting of some invisible sun somewhere on the other side of all that rock, but a day attuned to needs and needs alone. Except replace needs with wants. Then you had Shire time.
"We do still have duties, chores, and strife in this land,"
Bilbo had said when Thorin offered him this observation this morning, along with another cup of tea.
"Such as this writing that I would very much like to get done sometime this year."
"Why?" Thorin asked honestly. This was likely the question that got him exiled for the rest of the day. But Thorin's point remained. Bilbo worked for no deadline save his own, and he could, quite freely, if he had felt so inclined, come enjoy a pot of tea with his husband. But whether it was for anyone's benefit save his own didn't matter. Bilbo was in the last throes of his latest work, an updated and expanded edition of the Quest, edited for Hobbit sensibilities, so as Thorin suspected, to best offend them. And he simply couldn't, to quote Bilbo directly, stop his work every 5 minutes because Thorin would like to come in and chat. It was hard enough trying to make debates with Dale over the wheat tariff interesting. Whatever inspiration Bilbo could trap into propelling him through that section wouldn't stick around through another interruption.
"I don't remember you being this grouchy when you were writing the book in the first place,"
Thorin said. That's because when I was writing the book in the first place, you were dealing with the massive resettlement of your people into your ancestral home. And, I might add, being a considerable grouch yourself in the process." Thorin frowned, or perhaps, though he wouldn't be the one who said it, pouted.
"I don't remember being particularly grouchy.
Grouches never do." Thorin laughed and lingered, when Bilbo looked up at him from his papers curiously. Thorin tried to look as though he was merely studying the titles of the books on the shelf. "I am here," Bilbo said, leaning back in his chair. "I am sitting in the library, and I will be here in an hour or two when you get back." So Thorin had not been as subtle as he would have liked. He sighed.
"What a tactful way to tell me to piss off."
"I learned politics in Erebor, didn't I? Now piss off, love. I spent long enough getting fussed over while I waited for you, and my fussers had the very good excuse that I was dying at the time." Thorin almost said something about how he thought, after all their time apart, there was nothing wrong with a little fussing. But he stopped himself. Bilbo was right, even if he didn't know what he was reminding Thorin of. There was something too much like hoarding in Thorin's hovering. To Thorin, Bilbo was a drink from a bottomless cup. Thorin could have happily spent every moment of their lives together, gulping Bilbo's presence. Just being in the same room with him was enough. Sitting in the silent domesticity that rose to fill the spaces where danger and fear used to go. In his sickness, Thorin would have locked Bilbo in the mountain, his finest of gems. And Thorin thanked every day what little strength he had held onto in those hours, that he had never acted on the urge. But the sickness had only twisted what lived in Thorin's heart, and the sickness never really went away. Thorin wanted Bilbo every moment of every day until they died. Ideally within the same hour and based entirely on Bilbo's natural lifespan lived to its fullest. "My dear," Bilbo had said calmly when Thorin explained all this to him, the both of them lounging after dinner by the fire on Thorin's third day in the Shire. "This is why you need a hobby."
"I have a hobby."
"I am not a hobby."
"That wasn't what I was going to say."
"Then what were you going to say?"
"That I have several hobbies."
Bilbo had looked at him expectantly.
"Like whittling,"
Thorin had said. Bilbo had snorted. "Whittling isn't a hobby. It's a compulsion for you, and an endless source of sawdust for me."
"I thought you liked my whittling."
"I love your whittling. I haven't needed to worry about losing a pipe in years. But whittling alone isn't going to engage you."
"Why do you say that?"
"Dear, you are whittling as we speak." Thorin had looked down at the small bear figure he was perfecting. The carpet below him was tawny with dust. Messes were so much more visible above ground. In Erebor, if you dropped something on the floor, you could just kick it into the shadows, assured that no one would ever see it again. "Don't grind the sawdust into the carpet," Bilbo had said.
"I'm not."
"I'm watching you do it."
A trick of the light.
You're cleaning that carpet tomorrow.
I've seen you do the same with your pipe ashes.
I would never, Bilbo had replied primly, as he proceeded to use his big toe to rub a few ashes into the carpet. The point is, if you can hold a conversation while you do it, whatever you're doing is not engrossing enough. And I am not interesting enough to be the sole focus of your attention. And while romantics might say that love alone would make our every moment together pleasant, I don't think I could love you one drop more without bursting. And yet somehow there are whole moments in the day where I feel content without you by my side. Bilbo leaned back on the couch, brought his feet up, folded his hands over his stomach. I need time apart from you. You know that.
I know,
Thorin had said, and he did know. It was just...
It was easier to be apart from you when I was king.
Bilbo had chuckled, a sound warmer than the fire. True enough. It was being together that had been the tricky part then. No trick to it now. No trick at all. Thorin shook the memory from his head. He was not king now, and though that thought made him giddy with relief when he allowed himself to linger on it, presuming he could ignore any of the other thoughts that lurked around the edges, he had nothing yet to fill that gap in his life. Nothing except Bilbo, and his husband had made it clear that they'd technically had separate quarters in Erebor for a reason. Really, it ought to be me fretting, if either of us must, said Bilbo. You were the one who left me. I never went anywhere.
I am sorry,
Thorin said, again and always. I wasn't saying it to scold you, Bilbo said.
I assume you're always scolding me.
When I'm scolding you, you'll know.
That's why I assume you're always scolding me.
This is why I kick you out while I write.
Because I'm charmingly distracting?
Thorin held up his hands as Bilbo scoffed.
No need to dispute it. I see my danger to you now. You just can't think straight around me. I understand. I'm leaving. What do you want for lunch?
Bilbo rested his chin in his hand and glanced at his papers. A finished manuscript.
Barring that.
Perhaps some fish.
Some fish it is,
Thorin said, and, tempting Bilbo's wrath, snuck a kiss against his husband's forehead. Bilbo swatted Thorin away by caressing his cheek.
I'll pick up a fresh fillet on my way back from the tailor's.
Bilbo nodded distractedly, and then, as the words Thorin had said actually reached his brain, he said, The market? By yourself?
I can handle the market,
Thorin said. Bilbo opened his mouth.
I was a travelling smith, Bilbo. I have survived many small-town markets.
Bilbo shut his mouth. After a moment, he sighed. I suppose you're right, Bilbo said, as though he didn't suppose that at all. Just be on your best behavior. They'll remember everything you say and do don't say and do, for the rest of your life until you die, and then some. But I shouldn't worry. No, not at all. Bilbo squinted at Thorin dubiously. Do you need directions? I remember from our tour of the town. Bilbo pulled out a scrap of paper and started to write. I'm going to give you directions. I don't need directions. Here are some directions. Thorin took the directions. A few minutes later, after Thorin finally located his boots in the kitchen, he was half convinced Bilbo was hiding them. Thorin stepped outside, breathed in the summer breeze, and started his walk south. After another minute's thought and the compelling argument of the sun in the cloudless sky, Thorin ducked back to the house and grabbed Bilbo's father's old straw hat, which, being constructed to accommodate the girth of an aging hobbit gentleman in his later years of leisure, could have sheltered a small village under its enormous brim. The hat, in addition to making Thorin feel as though he were wearing a serving tray, was an incongruous addition to Thorin's wardrobe. He still wore the clothes he had arrived in 2 weeks ago, an outfit that, in addition to being severely worse for the wear and carrying the unshakable smell of bird, was horribly out of fashion for his new location. But nothing else would fit. There were very few hobbits Thorin's size, at least vertically, and none of them offered to share. The problem would end today at least. Diaz, in his absence, had gone to the effort of commissioning him a wardrobe before Thorin arrived. The tailor had put off making them, being the old-fashioned sort who insisted on actually measuring his clients. But when Thorin and Bilbo had gone in last week to get the details sorted out, the hobbit whipped a tape measure around Thorin twice and told him to come back next Tuesday. That had been Thorin's 4th day in the Shire, the day after Bilbo had told him that they'd need time apart, and then proceeded to escort him everywhere he went. Bilbo and Thorin had gone to market in the morning, and had spent the hour they were there being gawped at on all sides. It was as though Thorin waded through a shallow sea of eyes. It parted as he approached, and filled in so thoroughly in his wake that Thorin couldn't help but feel surrounded. A cloud of hush had enveloped them as they went. The sounds of the market, chatter, barter, laughter, clatter, all seemed to be happening several yards from wherever Thorin and Bilbo were. By the time Thorin and Bilbo had arrived there, the sounds had disappeared. Noise had walked ahead of them. Whispers had followed. When Bilbo had reached over to hold Thorin's hand, a susurrus rippled through the crowd like a strong wind through high grass. Bilbo had laughed and said to Thorin, "There, that'll forgive me everything to them. They'll chew on us for the rest of the century." "Nonsense," Thorin had replied. "We'll be so boring that they'll grow sick of us in a week." If he had privately felt nauseated by the attention, Thorin kept that thought to himself. That wasn't for Bilbo to worry about. "Maybe I should stay in today," Thorin thought, even as he knew he couldn't. Bilbo was right. Thorin needed to find his place in the Shire that wasn't just his husband. Thorin had made his choice, and he had burned the bridge behind him. Now it was time to see exactly what he had chosen. The stalls of the market loomed at the end of the road. Thorin tugged his hat on tighter, took a breath, and walked. He waited for the eyes, and the eyes found him. He waited for the silence, and the silence fell. But then the eyes, having looked Thorin up and down, turned back to where they had been looking before. The silence, having contemplated his arrival, rose again to let the noise settle back in.
"I'm not paying that, Herb, and you know why," said the hobbit nearest Thorin to another hobbit, presumably Herb, who then threw up his hands and began explaining exactly why the first hobbit should pay that. Across the street, in a stall overflowing with yarn in more varieties than Thorin knew existed, 2 women were bundling up what looked like a thread of the sky into a skein, laughing as they did so. 3 young children, perfectly genderless in the way that children are when they are small, happy, and half covered in dirt, ran around the women's legs, laughing and screaming. A hobbit in an apron was trying to push his cart past them, and a child almost succeeded in snatching a loaf of bread as he went. But then one of the women with the yarn, who hadn't seemed to be looking at the child at all, grabbed them by the ear. "Percival Burrows, don't think I won't tell your mother,"
she said, before the child squirmed free. The baker succeeded in fording the market entrance, only to promptly hit a roadblock of several goats being led past by another hobbit with a shepherd's stick.
"Oh, move it, Himley, we've got places to be,"
the baker shouted over the general din.
"I am moving it, Bert, and not my fault you got here late this morning, is it?"
the shepherd shouted back. A few goats bleated in what seemed like agreement. The baker came around to the front of the cart, and the shepherd shifted his stick, and Thorin prepared himself to see a fight. But then the 2 men clasped hands like they hadn't seen each other in some time, and settled into chatting, right there in the middle of the street. Herb, of the argument about why he wasn't going to get paid today, joined them and bought a seed cake. All this in the first minute. All this in the first 10 feet. And not a bit of the clamor aimed at Thorin. Thorin glanced down at his hands without thinking about it. Maybe the old straw hat worked like Bilbo's magic ring. You put it on, and suddenly you were invisible.
"You're the dwarf we were waiting on, then?"
said a voice by his elbow. Thorin turned around, and then, with an action he realized would have to become natural for him, looked down. A ruddy, sturdy woman with a face like a walnut studied him. She pulled a cart overflowing with flowers.
"Bit of an obvious thing to say, I suppose," she added. "Not too many folks around here with a beard and boots, now that Dears and her fellow are gone."
She put the arms of the cart down and wiped her hands on her apron before she offered one to Thorin.
"Mrs. Lily Twofoot. I live down on Briar Lane, south of the field."
Thorin took her hand. He'd never held a hobbit hand that wasn't Bilbo's, and hers was even smaller. His fingers swallowed hers, and he saw her eyes dart down in surprise. He released his grip instantly.
Thorin Oakenshield.
And, remembering Bilbo's advice, he bowed a little.
At your service.
At my service, eh?
Lily said, with a glint in her eye that suggested that she would have done just fine at the negotiating tables of Erebor. And that was how Thorin found himself hauling a cart through the market in the heels of a particularly diminutive hobbit with a hell of a bellow.
Move it, out of the roads!
Lily shouted cheerfully, herding the crowd with a great deal more efficiency than the shepherd had managed with his goats.
Flowers, seeds, and herbs for sale, once you let me get to my stall.
A fine mule you picked up, Mrs. Two-Foot,
a young man called from the crowd. Thorin's head shot up. The crowd laughed, and Thorin did not.
Still prettier than you,
Lily called back, and the crowd laughed again.
And with a hell of a kick,
Thorin added before he could help himself, something between a joke and a threat.
Oh, yes, well done.
He began to chastise himself.
That will make the hobbits love you.
And then, to Thorin's immense surprise, the crowd laughed once more without hesitation, and the conversation, started by the young man's shout, disintegrated back into the unfocused hubbub of the crowd. 101 conversations that, for a moment, had paid attention to a singular thing, and now that attention was over. Thorin blinked. Lily tugged on his sleeve.
Come on, then, she said. No pausing at the finish line, Master Dwarf.
Lily's stall was about a block away from the entrance, which put her nearly at the heart of everything. The entire market was, in Lily's words,
a stretch this way, a stretch that way, and not near enough space to fit everything when the farmers take up the back roads for laying out the summer harvest.
It had nothing on the markets of Erebor, sprawling beasts of light and jewels that stretched for miles into the deep. Streets where you could walk 100 yards and find every pleasure of creation labeled and priced before you. This was about the most densely packed hobbits ever got, Lily told Thorin as they unloaded the flowers together into a rickety stall that looked like once, long before the founding of Erebor, someone had painted it green. The markets were only like this during the first weeks of summer. Something about the sun made people eager to get out just when there was the least space for it. Give it a few weeks, Lily assured Thorin. Soon he would be able to walk through for shopping without having to elbow anyone out of the way.
Though I suppose it's nothing on your big city,
Lily added. She held out her hands, and Thorin passed her the next tray of seeds to be unpacked.
You're listening to me prattle on about the crowds, and you're thinking this is nothing.
In truth,
Thorin said, looking around at Hobbiton's merchant economy sprawled around him on all sides.
I was thinking how overwhelming this all is.
Lily frowned at him.
For you? Didn't you kill a dragon?
No, actually, Thorin said. I only succeeded in bothering it.
That's not what your sister told me.
My sister is here. My sister knows.
The thought flared up quick as fireworks. Quicker than the remembering that his sister had lived some months in the Shire. She had lived here, and she had left before Thorin arrived, and she wasn't here now. There was no one in the Shire but Bilbo and strangers. Thorin reminded himself of all this, and hoped Lily had not seen his flinch.
You spoke with my sister?
I told you I knew her, didn't I? I was in her book club, wasn't I?
Lily replied, which was the sort of statement for which Thorin probably should have demanded an immediate follow-up.
She told us all about you and your adventures.
1,000 childhood memories played rapidly through Thorin's mind.
I don't want to think what my sister was telling you.
Lily laughed.
Well, in any case, if all you'd done was marry Bilbo Baggins, that would be dragon-slaying enough.
She shook her head.
He's lucky to have you. I knew his mother, you know, and the things I could tell you about Belladonna Took. She didn't do well by her son. She made him a bit too much like her, which might have been all right if he wasn't a bit too much like Bungo as well, if you don't mind me saying.
I'm not sure what exactly you are saying.
Lily shook her head again.
Tooks are just difficult ones to love.
She winked at him.
Which I'm betting you're glad you didn't know before you married one.
Thorin was trying to puzzle out exactly what she meant when a customer came up, an older woman with pure white hair on her head and suspiciously brown hair on her feet. Lily greeted her with a stream of conversation that neatly pushed Thorin off to the side. Tucked next to Lily's flower stall, he studied the street more carefully. There was the sky, obviously. That was the biggest difference between being here and being there. Erebor's vaulted ceilings were so high as to often be invisible, but that didn't make them feel any more like the open air. Quite the opposite, actually. The issue with the sky was its unending visibility. It demanded upon you. Now it's bright. Now it's rainy. Now it's cloudy. Look at this sunset. In a way the architecture of Erebor never did. The architecture of Erebor simply was. It had been dreamed up, planned out, and carved up. After that, it existed, barring disaster or redecoration. It was what it was, and the sky was everything that it ever could be. What he said aloud when the customer was gone was,
The houses are very far apart here.
Suppose that's all a matter of perspective, Master Dwarf,
Lily said, without looking up from counting her money.
They sure seem close enough when the neighbors are fighting next door.
Thorin stayed with her a few minutes longer, but the stall was set up, and she now seemed neither in need nor want of him. She chatted with the people who came by with a familiarity that locked Thorin out as securely as a door. He stood by, looming and dumb nonetheless. Lily Two-Foot was the first hobbit he had ever talked to without Bilbo by his side, and her presence seemed like a buoy in a vast ocean. Thorin had never been very good at swimming. At least the hobbits weren't staring at him. They were looking at him, certainly, but they weren't staring at him. Thorin could handle being looked at. He'd been the only dwarf in town as a wandering blacksmith. He'd been a prince of his people. He'd been their king. He was comfortable being an anomaly. But there was the look of a people studying something new, and the look of a people casting about for stones. The hobbits of the Shire had worn a look that was uncomfortably between the two when Thorin and Bilbo had first come to market. Perhaps it had been nothing but surprise, though. They certainly seemed less ill-disposed now. Thorin took a deep breath that he hoped no one noticed.
Lily,
he began.
Mrs. Two-Foot, if you please,
Mrs. Two-Foot replied.
My apologies.
Mrs. Two-Foot waved him off.
Oh, you didn't know. In fact, call me Lily, if it suits you. Is that what dwarves do? Dears did warn me about your manners.
She warned you about my manners?
He asked, and Thorin didn't think at all about what it said that his sister's name fit so well in the mouth of this stranger, while he couldn't bear to say it aloud.
She said you wouldn't have any, and not to blame you because you were raised in the wilderness like a beast, and you did the best you could. She did say that if we told you what was right, you'd do it.
Mrs. Two-Foot paused for a moment to greet a passer-by. Thorin took the moment to contemplate the level of slander his sister was capable of spreading. For a moment, amusement nearly untwisted his shame.
You know, why don't you call me Lily? Your sister did by the time she left.
She earned that honor, did she?
Thorin said dryly.
Aye, she did,
Lily Two-Foot said, with as much quick sharpness as the woman who had snagged the child's ear.
A fine lady, and a good sister, though how could she not be after everything you did for her children?
Guilt rose like bile in Thorin's throat. Lily must have seen it, for she quickly added,
Making them kings and all.
She patted Thorin on the arm just above his elbow. Her height being what it was, she had to reach up a little to do so.
I don't pretend to know much about kings except what you hear, but you do hear the worst things about all of them. Dears told us that you stepped down because of Bilbo, so you could help him out, and that's how your nephew got to be king. We all agreed that was very decent of you.
Thorin
didn't know what to say to that. He didn't want to say anything at all. He didn't want to discuss his sister, or her children, or his impact upon them. He didn't want to now. He didn't want to ever. It was hard enough in Bag End watching Bilbo write letters to Erebor in the evenings. Bilbo wrote them nearly every night, as he said he had since he had woken up. Thorin would sit at another desk as he did so, writing gibberish on parchment himself so Bilbo wouldn't suspect. Thorin would close his nonsense up in an envelope addressed to his nephews in Erebor or his sister in Erin Luin. And each morning Thorin would wake early and take the letters out to the mailbox. When Thorin burned his own letters in the fire pit in the garden, he thought about burning Bilbo's as well. Bilbo's mentioned Thorin. They would. They had to. And when they arrived, everyone would know that Thorin was here, regrettably alive and too cowardly for their love. But Thorin knew the line of lies he could walk. He had hoarded too fiercely to ever trust himself against it. Thorin put Bilbo's letters in the mailbox every day and tried not to think about it. He was very good at that skill. In his life he had acquired so many things that he'd tucked away in the dark. But Lily was waiting for an answer. At a loss, Thorin fell back on Bilbo's advice this morning.
Thank you for saying so, Mrs. Lily. Please call me Thorin. Is there anything else I can help you with?
Lily regarded him with unnervingly perceptive eyes. She was a poor woman to have stuttered in front of.
No, Thorin. You are released from service.
Thorin bowed again, a little deeper than he would have normally, just because she was so short. He wasn't sure that she would notice if he had given her a shallow one. His hands, he realized, were shaking. He clenched them into fists and shoved his fists into his pockets.
If that's the case, could I beg a favor from you?
Depends on the favor, my boy.
Thorin pulled out Bilbo's directions from his pocket and showed them to her.
Can you tell me where any of the landmarks he noted are?
And a minute later, Thorin set off again for the tailor, this time with a map of the town freshly drawn on the paper that wrapped the bouquet he had purchased.
And Rothbart said that when it came time for clothes for the winter months, he could special order furs from the trappers he works with on occasion in Bree.
Thorin said as he laid out the plates, his voice raised so that Bilbo could hear him in the kitchen.
Having had a look at the scraps you hobbits call clothes, I wouldn't mind that.
Forgive us if we don't consistently feel the need to drape ourselves in the latest thing we killed, Bilbo called back from the kitchen over the hiss of oil. Rothbart, is it?
Am I saying it right?
Thorin asked.
I imagine so.
I've never called him by his first name myself. The cooking sounds in the kitchen, Bilbo's arcane art whereby heat and materials he crafted something that Thorin could never forge.
Yes, dear, perhaps because you keep thinking of the oven as a forge.
Replaced themselves with the scrape of knives against plates. Bilbo came in carrying the steaming vegetables and set the plate down next to the vase with Thorin's tulips. I ripped his waistcoat some years ago in a tussle, and he's never forgiven me.
You fought the town tailor?
Oh, he wasn't at that point the town anything. We were both about 6 at the time. Thorin pulled Bilbo's chair out, and as Bilbo sat, said,
No wonder he gave me such a look when I mentioned you.
Dare I ask what look?
Well, now I understand it as the look of a man remembering a long-ago battle he'd tragically lost,
Thorin said, seating himself.
At the time, I assumed you owed him money.
Bilbo snorted and served the fish. In his mind, I likely do. My mother went to him exclusively after Goodbody and Sons retired, and he practically came to her funeral with a bill for her last outfit. Thorin was getting enough feeling for hobbits that he suspected there was a great deal of leeway couched in that practically.
Well, he seemed pleasant when I spoke with him.
I'm glad, said Bilbo diplomatically. He speared a pepper and took a bite.
So, your journey to the market went well?
Thorin took a forkful of his salmon to disguise the smile on his face. The Bilbo Thorin had first met in Bag End would never have stooped so low as to talk with food in his mouth. and therefore it always seemed like a personal compliment to Thorin when he did.
"It went very well,"
Thorin said after a moment of considered chewing.
"Everyone I spoke to was polite, if distant. They're giving me leeway for my boorish behavior. I think my sister spent her time in the Shire conducting a smear campaign on my behalf."
"She is a woman who always needs to keep herself busy." Bilbo shook his head and speared another bite. "I'm glad it went well, at any rate. I was worried."
"I know,"
Thorin said.
"but I'm happy I went. There was no need to worry at all."
"I'm glad," said Bilbo once more.
"I heard plenty of stories about you,"
Thorin teased. Bilbo smiled without his eyes. They ate dinner, which was flavorful and hot and came in abundant amounts. Thorin asked Bilbo how his writing was going, and Bilbo replied that it had gone as well as could be expected. And Bilbo asked how the weather had been, and Thorin replied that it had been good, and looked to be good for the rest of the week, but who could tell with weather? And Bilbo said something about how he wasn't sure he should trust a dwarf's opinion about whether it would rain. And Thorin said something about how he'd lived on the surface for quite a long time, thank you, and he knew plenty about the sky. And Bilbo asked him what exactly he knew, and Thorin said,
"The white bits are clouds."
And then they both laughed, and then, eventually, dinner was done. And Bilbo, all through their conversation, never lost that look like he was chewing over worry along with his fish.
"You're sure the writing went well?"
Thorin asked as he poured out their tea. Bilbo, leaning back in his seat with his hands clasped over his stomach, said, "What? Oh, yes, it went very well. Well as could be expected. It's much harder to write about the aftermath than the adventure, you know. There's only so many ways you can make unending conversations about what belongs where interesting. It wouldn't have killed Bard or Thranduil to try another dramatic attack on Erebor during the peace talks. It would have made everything more interesting for everyone."
"I've often thought the same. But I suppose we did not reclaim Erebor so that our people could live exceptionally interesting lives."
Thorin hung the kettle back over the fire and enjoyed the warmth of the flames near his hands.
"Many people might argue that happiness begins where all the interesting bits end."
"Many might argue that, would they?" Bilbo asked. "And who might these many be?"
"Storytellers like you seem to be the principal people to blame. You're the ones who make happily ever after the ending."
Thorin looked back over his shoulder. Bilbo's eyes were lowered into his tea, his mouth made gentle in a troubled frown. He looked his age, Thorin thought suddenly, and didn't know why the thought came so suddenly or so unsettlingly. Bilbo glanced up and caught Thorin's eye. Surprise flickered across Bilbo's face. He clearly had thought himself unobserved. Bilbo always kept his most serious worries private. Bilbo's mouth hardened. "I've been writing about our time together in Erebor," Bilbo said. "I'm expanding the tale of our journey because I'm an author who knows how to take advantage of success, and because it's a story I think worthy of telling. He cut himself off and waved his hand as though he were flicking off some distasteful insect from it.
You know this. I'm interested.
You always say that, and I can't imagine why, Bilbo said. Then he held up his hand as Thorin opened his mouth.
No, dear, that wasn't me fishing for compliments.
His hand went to his temples, shielded his eyes. His other one rested on the table. Thorin took it. Bilbo ran his free hand down his face, pressed his hand to his mouth, and looked at Thorin with unreadable eyes. Thorin sat still and allowed himself to be read.
I need to ask you something, Bilbo said.
Then ask, Thorin said.
I have to admit that I don't want to.
Then you don't have to. Bilbo smiled wanly and studied Thorin a moment longer.
What would you have done if I hadn't gotten sick?
Thorin leaned back in his chair. He tried to pretend the gesture hadn't been a flinch.
I had a less stressful winter.
Bilbo gave Thorin a look, the kind that gains its capitalization after the 3rd year or so of marriage. Thorin sighed. He surprised himself when the truth slipped out.
I don't know. I think I would have left anyway.
Even if you didn't need to? Thorin said nothing. Bilbo nodded, almost to himself, as his eyes cast downwards again.
I was writing about Erebor. I was writing about you. And I realized I couldn't, because, as it turns out, I didn't have the faintest idea what was actually going through your head.
In the silence that followed this, Bilbo brought his mug to his lips, as close as he could get without drinking it. Bilbo always did that with his tea. He liked to feel the steam rising against his face. Thorin didn't remember when he had learned this. He couldn't imagine ever not knowing it.
The throne is a millstone that makes dust of us all,
Bilbo said quietly, his words aimed into his drink. Thorin's eyes darted up, and Bilbo met them.
That's what you wrote to Fili and Kili.
Thorin looked away.
Yes.
He offered no more.
When Diaz first came, she interrogated me about whether I'd turned you against Erebor. She thought that maybe this whole illness was a scheme hatched up to help you abscond here. I think she was very distressed to learn that I was actually sick. Like most schemers, my sister believes everyone around her is currently enacting some part of their 100-part plan, Thorin muttered, as opposed to just running off without thinking about it.
Thorin reached for his mug. He drank, didn't much like the taste, and kept drinking anyway.
I knew you were...
Bilbo paused.
Unhappy sometimes, at least in Erebor. So why didn't you tell me the extent of it?
His mouth twisted.
And for that matter, why didn't I know?
Thorin's gut twisted like the fish had gone sour. He found himself studying his hands as he answered.
It didn't have anything to do with you. So you felt no need to mention it to me? Bilbo pressed. None at all?
Hello, husband. Met with Balin today. Might try to finish reading this book tonight. I hate my life. How was your day?
I didn't hate my life,
Thorin interjected. And this he said with enough certainty that they could meet each other's eyes.
I knew you would take anything I said too dramatically.
Bilbo spluttered rewardingly.
You did not just accuse me of being the dramatic one in this marriage. Me, the dramatic one of the two of us.
I read your account of your encounter with Smaug. That was the most dramatic thing I've ever heard of.
I enhanced that for dramatic effect, for the sake of the children reading, who wouldn't be so interested in an account of a hobbit trying not to invisibly soil himself. And even if that had been exactly how I met Smaug, that would mean nothing, because nothing I've ever done has ever rivaled anything you've ever done in terms of sheerness.
Thorin laughed. My wordsmith.
You make me speechless.
Bilbo sipped his tea, but not before Thorin caught the smile curling on his lips. He added,
From exasperation, most likely. And you must admit that you have more dramatic flair than me.
I admit no such thing. In fact, several hobbits today remarked on how surprisingly quiet and restrained I am.
Don't get too cocky. That's just because Hobbiton only has Dwalin and Deers to compare you to.
It could have been worse,
Thorin said.
They could have had Filly and Killy.
Bilbo and Thorin laughed at the same time, and then promptly felt a little bad about it. Then Bilbo said,
Bofer, though.
And they laughed again. Then Bilbo sighed and got the look on his face that said, That was fun, but don't think you avoided anything.
Thorin, if you were unhappy here, would you tell me? Or would you keep it secret again?
Thorin shook his head firmly.
I am not unhappy here, and I won't be.
That's not what I asked, and impossible for you to know.
Bilbo glanced away.
I promise you, it's quite possible to be unhappy in the Shire.
Thorin leaned forward in his chair, his elbows on his legs.
Bilbo, if in Erebor I was ever discontented, how could I speak of it? If I ever was, how could I? Not without feeling like a traitor to my people, to my family, to myself.
He spread his hands as if he could grasp the words he was trying to say. He had never spoken them aloud before. He had barely thought them.
If Erebor had not made me happy. I had wanted Erebor for so long. What would have been wrong with me if I hadn't wanted it after all?
You are still talking in hypotheticals, Bilbo said. You complain to me all the time. You tore your hair out over meetings. You could have said the larger unhappiness as well.
You complained often enough of headaches and colds, Thorin said. Why then didn't you tell me that you were so sick until it was almost too late?
Bilbo fell silent.
I didn't want to worry you,
Thorin said.
There was no reason to worry.
After a moment, Bilbo drained his mug and rested it on the table.
I suppose if I tell you that when it comes to you, I prefer to be worried.
You'll only turn that against me? There is nothing we need to worry about, either from the past or the present, Thorin said. But if something happens, I'll try. I will. Good, said Bilbo, who stood and started gathering the plates. Bilbo always had a very shallow well of emotional wherewithal for discussions like this. The first time they had confessed they loved each other, Bilbo had begged off a few minutes later, saying that he had to go lie down now. Thorin grabbed his wrist as Bilbo reached for Thorin's plate. Bilbo's pulse was strong and steady under his fingers, a sensation that had yet to fail to make Thorin swoon with relief. And you'll tell me, Thorin said, looking Bilbo in the eyes. You'll tell me if something is wrong with you. Bilbo looked back, his eyes unreadable again. His mouth twitched up. Come help with the dishes. Bilbo slipped out of Thorin's grasp. His fingers curled around air. And is everything all right? Thorin asked his husband as he picked up the plates. As well as can be expected, Bilbo replied, which was really no answer at all. But before Thorin could ask anything else, Bilbo added, I'll wash, you dry, and disappeared into the kitchen once more. And Thorin had been married to his burglar long enough to know the sound of a conversation being, at least for the moment, firmly over. A door shut and locked. So Bilbo washed, and Thorin dried, and when they went to the living room, Bilbo brought Thorin's flowers with them and placed them on the window-sill. Then Bilbo sat at his desk and wrote his letters to Erebor. Thorin held his quill over his blank page until the ink dried. Then he put the quill down and let the page sit blank. When Bilbo finished writing, Thorin was stoking the fire. As Bilbo sealed his envelope, Thorin pulled out a book to read. If Bilbo thought it odd that Thorin wrote nothing, Bilbo said nothing. As Bilbo settled on the couch beside him, Thorin felt curiously weightless. Maybe this was what it felt like when you refused to carry even one more silent lie on your back. I will never see Erebor again, Thorin said to himself as Bilbo rested his head on his arm. I will not look back to try. On his first day back, Bilbo told Thorin that he was a few hours' walk from Bag End. Thorin told Bilbo that he was sure that he'd told the eagle who had brought him here the right place to drop him off. Bilbo had reached up to cup Thorin's face. No, Bilbo said, his eyes wet. You daft fellow, you're miles off. On his first day back, Thorin embraced his husband, and on their first night together in Bag End since the last first night, Bilbo brought Thorin into the room Bilbo had described to him 1,000 times before. Bilbo's room looked nothing like Thorin had imagined. Bilbo's bedroom had been off limits during the party, which meant the dwarves went in only a couple of times to grab extra pillows and blankets or to see what was in there. But Thorin hadn't been one of them. And so Bilbo's bedroom was as strange and foreign to him as Erebor must have seemed to Bilbo.
"It's lovely,"
Thorin said, with a shyness he didn't understand. He felt shyer now than he had only moments before, washed in a bath by his husband in front of the fireplace. But this was different. This was Bilbo's room. The room Bilbo had dreamed in during the years of his life that Thorin had never known. This was the room Bilbo had retreated to and listened to Thorin's song, sung for everyone at the party besides him.
"I never knew the Bilbo who slept here,"
Thorin thought.
"I only knew the Hobbit who ran away."
"You needn't gawp like that," Bilbo said. He carried a candle into the room and lit the lamps as he went until the space glowed. Nothing like gold, nothing like a forge. The room smelled like wood and cotton and the flowers on the bedside table. Bilbo placed the candle on the book beside them. Bilbo always slept with a book in reach, and often with more. One to read, one to write. More than once in the middle of the night, Thorin had woken to the sound of a quill scratching like rats in the wall. In the morning, Thorin would laugh at his poor burglar as he tried to interpret what he'd written in the midst of sleep in the pitch dark. The sight of a book placed at the ready to read, a sight almost as familiar as Bilbo himself, loosened something in Thorin's chest, loosened a grip on Thorin's throat.
"Where shall I put my clothes and boots?"
Thorin held his travel clothes in a bundle in his arms. Bilbo had taken him from the bath and dressed him in a sleeping gown of Dias's creation, the embroidery on the sleeves her signature. Bilbo hooked his fingers under his braces and slid them from his shoulders. "Just on the floor there for now. We'll sort it out later. You haven't many things, clearly, but we'll find a place for them." Thorin gripped the bundle all the tighter. Then Thorin summoned the courage that he hadn't realized had fled. He placed his clothes upon the ground just to the side of the door. The boots thudded onto the floor.
"I'll take care of them in the morning,"
Thorin said.
"I don't want my things getting in your way."
"Our things," Bilbo said, unbuttoning his waistcoat. "Our way. This is your house too now." Then Bilbo took off his trousers, stepped neatly out of them, and hung them with his waistcoat over a chair by the window. He pulled back the covers and crawled in wearing only his shirt. Bilbo had gotten into the habit of his shirt as nightwear in Erebor. He claimed it made dressing easier in the morning, and indeed Bilbo could get away with wearing the same shirt for days on end. It was only the waistcoat people paid attention to, Bilbo claimed. The waistcoat and the blazer and everything else was ignored. Thorin had argued the point once, for no real reason beyond arguing the point, and Bilbo had scrunched up his nose and replied, "Thorin," called Bilbo softly, "come to bed." Thorin went to bed. He went to the side of the bed Bilbo wasn't lying on, the side without the end table and the candle and the flower and the book. and Thorin drew back the covers that went up to Bilbo's chest. Thorin climbed into Bilbo's bed. His husband lay beside him in the soft, warm light of the room. He was so beautiful. Bilbo, his love alive, beside him, warm, smiling, alive. Thorin's tongue felt foreign in his mouth. It was someone else's, a fat, heavy intruder, and he could not move it to form the words that ought to exist outside Thorin's head. Bilbo reached over. His hand cupped Thorin's cheek. "Don't ever leave me again." Thorin's gaze softened, and the room became a hazy glow. Even Bilbo lost what clarity he had had. "Oh, don't cry, dear, don't cry," Bilbo murmured, but his hands were soft as tears against Thorin's face. "I want to cry," Thorin managed. He held Bilbo's hands and brought them to his lips. He kissed Bilbo's wedding ring, now restored. "You look best through tears." Bilbo laughed, a bell of pure mirth. "Good heavens, what a horrible compliment!" "I just mean that you always make me want to cry." Bilbo buried the side of his face into the pillow, still laughing. "Why don't you try that one more time?" "Not all tears are evil ones." Thorin reached out and pulled his laughing husband against him. "You are too beautiful for me to look at without some protection." Thorin could count on both hands the times he had made his husband blush. The opposite was far more often the case. But Bilbo looked away now, still laughing a little, and Thorin would have to start keeping track on his toes as well. "I'm too beautiful?" Bilbo sat up so that he loomed most pleasingly over Thorin. "Please, half the Shire will be composing love poetry to you as we speak." "I don't want their poetry," said Thorin. "Only yours." "Good," Bilbo replied, with an unexpected solemnness, "because everything I ever write has always been for you, even before I met you." He shifted, settled over Thorin, his weight heavy in Thorin's lap. A good weight, a sturdy weight, the weight of health and 7 meals a day, of fat and muscle and sturdy bones, of provisions for winter stored in the belly and thighs, of a body with a long future to prepare for. "I'm a secret romantic, you see," Bilbo said, "waiting all my life for my best story." He leaned down and kissed Thorin's nose, and then he kissed Thorin's cheeks, and he kissed Thorin's lips, and he kissed Thorin's chin. Slowly, slowly, each kiss a blessing. Bilbo kissed his way along Thorin's beard, and he kissed where hair met scalp. When Thorin closed his eyes, Bilbo kissed his eyelids, and he kissed the tracks of tears that were not sad. No, not sad at all. And when he was done kissing, he bowed, his arms on either side of Thorin's head, and their foreheads pressed together. "I love you," Thorin breathed against Bilbo's lips. "Yes, obviously, dear," Bilbo murmured back. "And I love you. Mahal, I love you." Thorin's arms rose and encircled Bilbo. And if he thought it strange that all that mattered in the world could be held in his arms, it was no less perfect for being strange. Rather like Bilbo himself in that regard. Thorin remarked upon this to his husband, who laughed against Thorin's neck. And there, in the soft candle flicker, against wood and memory, they moved once more into the familiar foreign landscapes of each other's bodies. On a pleasant Sunday morning, in Thorin's 4th week in the Shire, he overslept. It was a novel occurrence for him. He wasn't sure he had ever overslept before, and he might have enjoyed lying in bed a while longer and examining how it felt. He didn't, of course, because the day Thorin learned to sleep in was the day that he was meeting Primula Brandybuck for tea, and he had managed to sleep in until the exact moment that they were supposed to be meeting. The last time Thorin had gone from horizontal to vertical so quickly was when an orc raiding party had ambushed his camp. The sight of the clock announcing the time as exactly 11 in the morning was only slightly less terrifying. Thorin didn't bother looking for his boots. Trying to remember how his braces worked had taken up enough time. He flew out the front door of Bag End at 6 minutes past the hour, with his hair flying and his shirt tails flapping. Then he doubled back.
"Bilbo!"
Thorin called, rapping on the closed library door.
"I'm going into town."
After a moment, Thorin heard a distant, "Have fun, dear," through the door.
"Would you like to come?"
Thorin asked.
"I'm meeting Miss Brandybuck today. I thought you might like to come. You haven't seen her since I arrived."
There was such a long pause that Thorin thought Bilbo perhaps hadn't heard him. Then Bilbo said,
"No, thank you. I'm fine. And she invited you specifically. I wouldn't want to impose. But send her my regards."
Thorin raised his fist again. Then he sighed and pressed his palm softly against the grain of the door.
"Are you sure?" Thorin asked. "You've cooped yourself up working for days now."
There was no reply. It took Thorin a moment to realize that there wouldn't be. Thorin made it to the town square in a matter of minutes. The time he saved was proportional to the spectacle he caused. People in the Shire, Thorin had discovered, did not generally run. They ambled, they moseyed, they strolled, and under conditions of the greatest duress, they could occasionally be put upon to bustle. Jogging was something you were supposed to grow out of, and running was a cause for alarm. Sprinting was a myth. This, like all universal truths that hobbits held, patently false in practice, and any hobbit who found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time, an occurrence there was no shortage of around here, could break land speed records. But hobbits believed it to be true that no proper hobbit would ever run. And in a conflict between how things ought to be and how they were, No self-respecting inhabitant of the Shire would base their understanding of the world upon the latter. Thorin was, of course, excused from this complex arithmetic, being obviously and hopelessly foreign. And so, as he ran his way to the Whitfoot tea-room, Thorin garnered mostly amusement from the hobbits who glimpsed him blurring past.
"What's the rush, Master Dwarf?"
someone called to him from the side of the road.
Call the constable! We got a dwarf loose!
Someone else joked, and a third shouted as Thorin skidded to a halt in front of the tea-room.
"Them hairless feet can sure move!"
"They can, but they shouldn't," Thorin grumbled as he limped to the door. He'd be picking pebbles out of his soles all day. He wasted a moment patting his hair down, tucked in his shirt into his trousers as best he could without knocking his braces loose, and pushed open the door at 11:15 in the morning. The neighborhoods of Hobbiton, within a short walk from Bag End, contained approximately 36 various shops in which you could sit and drink any variety of liquid, so long as they were quaffed in high volume. Thorin, over the last 2 weeks since his solo excursion to the market, had been to nearly all of them. Lily had sent him an invitation to lunch the day after they met, at which point she brought her 27 grandchildren into the parlor and introduced Thorin to the lot of them. So on Monday, Susan and her husband Wright took Thorin over to the Rose and Thorn, after which he went over with them to meet Wright's brother Gibbons at the Crowning Glory. And Gibbons told Thorin that his best friend had been working on a project with Dwalin, and did Thorin want to come around and see it? Which is how Thorin ended his afternoon consulting upon a tiny rocking chair being carved for Gibbons' friend's sister's newborn daughter, who had just turned 1 and kept trying to grab Thorin's beard. On his way home that evening, Thorin stopped in a shop and bought a schedule book. Suddenly, he had no shortage of appointments. Most hobbits invited him to their homes, but they invited him out as well, and Thorin would sit at the kitchen table with Bilbo in the mornings, reading through his list of meetings for the day. Bilbo would lean back in his chair and pass commentary. What made a hobbit, it seemed, was not the feet or the ears or anything so prosaic as that. A hobbit was someone who knew the Shire with encyclopedic breadth and depth. Even the things Bilbo didn't know, he knew. "I've never met Myra Boffins," he might say contemplatively, "but her mother is only a few years older than me, and she married Rollington Grocer, my former maths tutor, when I was 30 or so, and considering Myra's age, she must be a honeymoon baby. In the sense of the reason, there was a honeymoon because this baby was on the way, which is a neat solution to the problem they had, since Minnie's mother was dead set against her daughter marrying some shabby academic. The Boffins, as a rule, not trusting anyone who can read a 3-syllable word. I would hope that has changed with Myra's generation, but old habits die hard. Do try to figure out their general literacy." "You could figure it out yourself," Thorin would counter, "as they've invited you also." And Bilbo would wave that off. "Make excuses for me. They'll have heard them all before, and be expecting them." There was no family Bilbo did not have some relation with. There was no location in which Bilbo had not been. Almost. The Whitfoot Tea Room, that rarest of exceptions. An establishment in the Shire that Bilbo didn't know. It had opened the year after Bilbo left and was still regarded with suspicion. In a brief conversation with Rose Chubb during one of Thorin's now daily walks to the market, he had learned that the inhabitants of Hobbiton still referred to the tea room as that new place. Looking around the sun-dappled parlor, Thorin didn't see anyone particularly troubling at all. But the patrons, sipping, chatting, and reading, did have a different look about them than the hobbits Thorin had seen in the shops and restaurants that had been there so long they named the street they sat on. The hobbits in Whitfoots wore their hair in braids, left their waistcoats unbuttoned, dangled small bronze hoops from their ears. One man by the door had hair nearly down to his elbows. A woman sat in the window seat alone, reading a book with her sleeves rolled up and her skirt spread out around her. Two young ladies tucked away in a corner together were both wearing trousers, albeit one's so voluminous that they looked like dresses at the first glance. Thorin had been in the Shire long enough to realize that he should be shocked right now. You had to be at least a little bohemian to come to the new place in the Shire. And so here were the Shire's little bohemians. Primula Brandybuck, in contrast to her surroundings, looked every bit the proper hobbit lass that Thorin had learned to recognize. Her hair was neatly down, her skirt was respectably long, and her light green shirt was so crisp that it could have stood up without her. But she sat with such ease in what amounted to a den of sin, by the Shire's standards at least, who might have welcomed a brothel on their main street so long as it had been there for a decently long time, that her appearance seemed almost sarcastic, respectability as a costume. She saw him and waved. "You're late," she said, as Thorin came over to her table. "I ordered for us."
"I apologize profusely," Thorin said as he sat down.
"Don't make a habit of it. Hobbits respect punctuality very much. We're awful sticklers about it."
She poured Thorin's tea.
"Is it different for dwarves?"
"No, we respect being on time as well. I was being inconsiderate as an individual, not as a representative of my entire race."
Primula didn't smile.
"I ask because your sister was always late to everything. I think it was because she liked to make a dramatic entrance. I saw you running down the street, by the way. The two of you have that in common. Sugar?"
"No, thank you,"
said Thorin, who could never understand why anyone would need anything in tea besides tea. Primula handed him his cup, which he took with thanks, and sipped it, even though tea was the last thing he wanted at this moment. His heart was still pounding from his run, and now that he was sitting down and the adrenaline was subsiding, he could feel his sweat prickling in the shadowed coolness of the room. One drop in particular was rolling down his spine as he sat as straight as he could to try to stop the back of his shirt from getting damp. It was on this drop, and not the mention of his sister, that he placed the source of his discomfort.
"Dwellin wasn't late much,"
Primula continued.
except when he and Dear started getting thick as thieves together, and then he'd be late with her. But mostly he turned up when he said he would, and if he hadn't said he would, he'd be there anyway. He was a soldier, right? I'd never met a soldier before. Just the town constables, which aren't the same thing at all. They're a bit less about showing up when they say they will, and more about showing up when they're sure all the trouble is over.
I know that's not fair, Miss Brandybook,
said an older gentleman at the next table over.
Our boys work hard.
That they may, but it ain't that constable-lating,
Primula replied.
Excuse me, said Thorin. This is a private conversation.
The man looked at him, confused.
And why are you having it in public?
At that moment, a woman shrouded in a faint cloud of flour appeared at their table with 2 plates in hand. Primula had ordered them both a slice of the dessert of the day, a white cake so saturated with the raspberry syrup drizzled on it that the plate looked like blood on the snow. It was in the culinary style of the Shire, cloyingly sweet in a way that teetered between decadent and disgusting. Thorin had a theory that the desserts of the Shire were just a way to prepare the palate for yet more tea. It was a very neat, closed loop of a cuisine that Thorin was sure he'd find tolerable someday. Primula licked her fork clean. The raspberries had stained her lips and tongue red.
"Thank you for meeting me today,"
she said, not sounding that grateful.
It's my pleasure,
Thorin said, which had been true, at least. He had wanted to come when he had received her invitation in the mail, to speak to her as he'd hardly had the chance to when he'd first arrived in the Shire. Thorin had not had eyes for anyone except Bilbo, and the 2 other hobbits who'd been living in Bag End, recognizing that, kindly and promptly made themselves scarce. Thorin had to admit that his first impressions had led him to believe that Primula was a bit pleasanter than he was currently experiencing.
"It was your pleasure, but you were late."
I apologize again, said Thorin. I overslept.
Primula sniffed like she wasn't sure why someone would admit to a vice like that in public. She took another bite of cake. Thorin, not knowing what else to say, took another bite as well and quietly gagged.
How are you?
He asked after a moment of strained silence.
"Very well,"
she said stiffly.
"And you?"
Very well.
"And Mr. Baggins?"
Thorin paused.
He's well as well.
"Well."
Yes.
They both took another bite. In truth, Thorin was not exactly sure himself about the wellness of Bilbo, but he saw no need to say anything about that to this stern woman wearing an unpleasant grimace. Marriage was keeping another person's secrets.
Why did you want to speak with me today?
Thorin asked. Primula looked a little affronted by the question.
"Do you need a reason? I nursed your husband back to health, and no mean task considering both the illness and the patient. I didn't think I had to earn an audience with the king. Or if I did, which I wouldn't have wanted to if I'd known, I would have thought I'd well earned it already."
I meant no offence, said Thorin rapidly. I only wanted to know if you had something I could help you with, or if you sought payment for your work.
"Payment?"
Primula drew herself up.
"If I needed payment, you would know, sir. I wouldn't lure you to tea so I could blindside you with a bill in public like a common street seller. I can talk of money, Master Dwarf, but I'm not so low as to do it out loud. I am a brandy-bock."
"Then what?" asked Thorin, who felt it clear that his attempts to assure his lack of intended offense was only causing it. Primula glared at him. It was the kind of look that sets you immediately thinking when the last time you'd eaten a proper vegetable and brushed your teeth was.
"Has it occurred to you that I might want to get to know the dwarf I heard so much about?"
She cocked her head at him.
I dedicated a winter of my life to the care of your husband, in the close company of your sister, and living with your friends. And in that time, how could I not be curious about you, when those who loved you spoke so highly of you, even as they were cursing you, and when they left back to their lives to...
Primula swept her arms out and narrowly avoided backhanding the waiter, who promptly went scuttling back away.
"Went who knows where in the whole wide world, and maybe never to be seen again. It was me and Drogo who waited with Mr. Baggins. And when you returned, we knew it was our time to go, and we were happy for it. But, sir, 4 weeks you've been in Bag End. 4 weeks, sir, and not an invitation issued, not a kind word sent our way for the work we did. And no, I don't mean money, sir, but it would be no problem on your part to say a thank you and mean it."
She brought her hands back together, folded in her lap. She could have slipped very easily into her picture of quiet respectability, if not for the red in her cheeks.
"That's why I wanted to speak to you today."
Thorin sat aghast, as did the rest of the tea room, although Thorin suspected their aghastment to be streaked with more delight than his.
"Miss Brandybuck, I had no idea,"
Thorin said. Primula sniffed and looked away.
I don't know what to say. I do thank you, and I mean it, truly. You saved Bilbo's life. You stayed with him. That I haven't made clear to you my deepest gratitude for your work is shameful on my part."
"That's pretty good,"
Thorin heard one woman mutter.
"Could use more grovelling,"
another woman replied.
"Shush,"
said Thorin. To his surprise, they shushed. Primula pursed her lips. Thorin had great difficulty remembering that even as hobbits went, she was very young. She gave more the impression of an elderly matriarch who had been disappointed by at least 3 successive generations.
"It wasn't work,"
she said.
"I'm sorry?"
Thorin asked.
"It wasn't work, Mr. Oakenshield. Why I stayed with him, nursed him as I did."
Primula sat ramrod straight in her chair.
"It was friendship, on my part at least."
Then she looked down, and suddenly, yes, now Thorin could see that she was young indeed.
"Then you come back, and we're gone without so much as a proper goodbye. Just get our stuff and go. We're not needed any more. A winter together, and now we're strangers again."
After a moment, Primula shrugged, her mouth firm.
"So, I just thought I might meet the dwarf who made me and Drogo so unnecessary to our friend."
Thorin stood, the chair scraping in the silence. Primula's eyes followed him. They widened when he offered her his arm.
"My husband is a very strange man,"
Thorin said solemnly. Primula's mouth twitched just for a moment.
"Why don't we discuss exactly how?"
Thorin glanced around the room, leaning forward to listen.
In private.
Thorin loved his husband, and Thorin knew his husband, which is why he could say with certainty that Bilbo had a knack for avoiding people who wanted to see him, and that was perhaps his strongest qualification for the position of burglar. For the first year in Erebor, Thorin remembered the running joke of the company was how they had gotten to where they'd needed to go, but they'd somehow lost the burglar again. He was always where everyone else wasn't, especially when strangers started to pour into the city. Bilbo helped where he could, often alongside Owen at the bedside, or Ori in the library. But just as often you'd turn around to ask him something, and he'd be gone. It had been truly infuriating at first that Bilbo would wander off without telling anyone where, in a city where half the artifices were crumbling and the other half had crumbled. And if you asked him where he had been, Bilbo would just smile and say he'd been off for a walk. Thorin picked a few fights about it that Thorin promptly lost. Bilbo was like a cat, half the time lolling about in whatever soft warm spot he could find, the other half of the time skulking through the night with his claws unsheathed. And there was no point trying to stop him from doing either as he pleased if you wanted to keep his affection. Beaufort, in particular, had complained of Bilbo's disappearing acts. He had been the closest of Bilbo's friends among the company, the closest even as they settled into Erebor. But Thorin had ended many a meeting with the Toymakers Guild, with Beaufort admonishing him to stop keeping Bilbo all to himself.
"We'd like to see him too, you know,"
Beaufort would say, and Thorin would protest something to the effect that if Beaufort thought that Thorin had any control over the Hobbit's comings and goings, then Beaufort very kindly overestimated his king. Then the next time Thorin would see Bilbo, which, with their schedules, could be the next hour or the next day, he would convey Beaufort's message, and Bilbo would wince and confess to dodging social calls with his good friend. And within the week he would stop by Beaufort's quarters for dinner, and everything would be fine. Until 6 months later, when Beaufort would corner Thorin again. Just about everyone who knew Bilbo had to learn to tolerate his absences. The company was always the most forgiving of it, perhaps because in the course of the quest they'd all heard Bilbo complain so often and bitterly of what he'd give to have this mad group of dwarves on the other side of a barricaded door, that you could hardly be surprised when he locked people out. And on the other side, the people who never liked Bilbo, the dwarves who had raised not a hand to reclaim Erebor, but thought they deserved some say in who lived in it, thought Bilbo's demurral of invitations, his early exits of parties, and his general indifference towards society life as proof that he was nothing more than a hobbit who thought too highly of himself. It wasn't that Bilbo was a hermit. He'd made friends with new dwarves. He joined committees. He'd organized events. He eventually stopped using his magic ring when he went through the city so he wouldn't have to risk small talk. Or, on reflection, Bilbo had at least told Thorin he'd stopped doing that. But to be fair, Thorin did generally believe him. But Thorin never got the sense that company came naturally to Bilbo. That when Bilbo was listing the pleasures of his life, friends and relations would come in decidedly below books, his favorite armchair, and a pipe. Bilbo often walked away from conversations with a look on his face that said, "That was very enjoyable, but on the other hand, I could have been reading." Bilbo had once confessed to Thorin that the reason he enjoyed parties so much was that you could see everyone you liked in one go and get it over with. It was a practical mindset from a certain perspective. From another perspective, it was a cold one.
"I don't understand,"
Primula said, and threw another rock. This one skipped the pond 4 times before it sunk. It was her personal best. She gave him a smile with no shyness about its proudness. Thorin gave her a thumbs up.
I mean, I do understand, sort of. I'd heard all sorts of things about Mr. Baggins before he left, but I never much paid attention to it. I thought him being a bit of a recluse was just part of the things people always said. How could he be going off to the city like he did?
Thorin tossed his rock contemplatively for a moment, then let it fly. It skipped 12 times, terrorized a passing duck, and popped over straight onto the other side. Primula snorted.
The only way he lived in a city was that we tricked him into it, Thorin said. He certainly hadn't been planning to move to Erebor, which was a ruin, I should remind you, when he joined up.
Still, he couldn't be that standoffish. Not when you've got people everywhere.
Thorin walked up the water a ways, keeping an eye out for good throwing rocks. He'd discovered this pond a week ago on a very circuitous route home from Mrs. Earwort, who'd invited him over for tea and to see if he could finish up the armoire that Dwalin had started for her. Dwalin had apparently started odd jobs for half the town, and Dwalin had cheerfully passed on Thorin's name as the person who would finish all of them. Thorin couldn't figure out if his friend had been trying to pave the way for Thorin to meet the town, or inflicting some final revenge in the form of compulsory day labor for exacting old ladies. The old ladies were all very nice. They asked when Thorin would bring his husband around, and Thorin would smile a terse smile and offer no answer at all. When Thorin had brought Primula here, after a tense walk from Whitfoot's, she told him that this used to be a popular fishing spot. But then a child wandered out one summer's night. He'd made himself a raft and thought to sail. He'd drowned instead, and after that all the fish got blight and turned belly up. No one fished here any more. When Thorin had asked her who the child was, Primula had replied that it was a Longtoes child. He'd drowned hundreds of years ago, but the Shire remembered.
A city isn't the same as a town,
Thorin said after some thought. And indeed, he had been thinking about this since he'd arrived in the Shire, which he was now realizing was not a region inhabited by hobbits and characterized by pastoral beauties. Or rather, that was what the Shire was, as drawn on a map and described by diplomats. But Thorin, it turned out, was not actually living in the Shire. You couldn't live in the Shire, not the same way that you could live in Erebor, where you joined the thousands around you in a teeming mass that, yes, divided itself into districts, but still belonged to the city. There was no teeming mass that equaled the Shire. Instead, Thorin was living in Bag End and the neighborhoods of Hobbiton that intercepted it. Primula was looking at him as if she was waiting for more, so Thorin said,
Do you know your neighbours?
Of course.
Not just the ones next door. I mean the ones across the street and down the street and around the way.
Of course,
Primula repeated, as if Thorin was being thick.
Right, said Thorin. And you know their relatives?
Aye, as they know mine.
And you know their problems, their personal lives, their jobs, their hobbies, their favourite meals?
Ah,
Primula chewed her lip.
So you don't be knowing of things like that in the city?
You live with people,
Thorin said.
You live with quite a lot of people, but they don't collectively make the same demands on you as the individuals of the small town do. Living here, it's a lot like being a noble back home. You're related to everyone. You all remember slights from 12 generations back. The property squabbles are never-ending, and half your cousins have tried to kill each other.
Or tried to sleep with each other, depending on which part of the Shire you're talking about.
Primula smiled wryly.
And not our part, of course.
She tossed her rock at the water.
So, in a city, you don't matter. No one knows you, so you can disappear. Is that what Bilbo liked?
That wasn't quite it, but Thorin wasn't sure how to say such a thing to someone who had never in her life met a stranger. Primula had met people she hadn't known, but someone she knew had known them. And thus the family tree, which comprised the entirety of her life, had reached out its tendril to ensnare them. Even Thorin had never been a stranger to her. He was Bilbo's husband, connected solidly to her world by a new black line drawn connecting their names.
It turns out there's no need to go invisible through the city,
Bilbo had exclaimed to Thorin once, overjoyed by his discovery.
No one here makes small talk.
The city was a world of strangers. In a city, you could be anything. You could be a burglar if you kept up your antics. You could be the consort to a king if you signed the paperwork. Even Bilbo, unavoidably marked by his race, could remake himself as he pleased. An apple plucked and flung quite far from the tree where it began. No one knew him, and therefore he found his place just fine. No one had known what his place ought to have been, so when Bilbo made it, there was little objection. People may not have liked him, but they didn't dispute him. They didn't know who he was supposed to be. The only person in Erebor whom everyone knew who he should be was Thorin. And that hadn't seemed like a problem until it was.
Bilbo takes breaks from people,
Thorin said in lieu of pursuing that train of thought. He held out to Primula a perfectly flat stone.
It's best not to take it personally.
Primula shook her head.
You skip it. It'd just be wasted on me.
She looked out at the water, her hands tucked into her skirt's pockets.
I suppose I don't need to take it personally, but it's still very rude.
Thorin turned the stone over in his hand and gave it a throw. It hit the water at a bad angle, skipped twice, and promptly sunk.
Yes, I suppose it is,
Thorin said.
Does Diaz live in a city too?
Primula asked. He knelt and snatched up another rock.
A smaller one than Erebor.
She said you'd say something like that. Has she written you yet?
No,
said Thorin curtly. He hoped Primula interpreted it as worry, and then promptly hated himself. He wouldn't lie, it seemed, but actively hoping people misinterpreted him was still apparently acceptable to his cowardly heart. She crossed her arms and stared out at the water in the way you do when you're staring at nothing.
She hasn't written me either.
It would have been easier if she'd sounded either sad or matter-of-fact. Instead, she fell somewhere in between, a soft acceptance sculpted by an accent of grief.
Neither have Dwalin or Toriel, and they said they would.
He turned over the rock in his hands.
Have you written them?
Of course,
she said so easily that Thorin envied her.
I said I would, and so I did. Send my letters off once a week.
Mail always takes a long time to get to and from mountains.
Maybe.
She hesitated.
Diaz had a raven. It flew back and forth quick as you please. I thought you might have one as well.
Thorin had a raven, the one that he had sent begging to the eagles. It had come to the Shire with him, and then on the morning after his arrival, he'd taken it out to the garden of Bag End and told it to wait for him in the field where the eagles had dropped him off, to live there a while until Thorin came for him. Bilbo had seen the raven take off and asked,
Sending news of your arrival to Erebor?
And Thorin had said yes.
My raven is away,
Thorin mumbled. Shame tasted like rotten fruit and choked him.
I'm sorry.
It's all right,
she said with a gentle sigh.
I thought I'd ask.
After a pause, Primula skipped another rock. It jumped off the surface 6 times before it, too, sank. Lunch was nearly done when the smell of smoke made it all the way to the library. Thorin was just batting at a small grease fire in the pan when Bilbo came running out, saying,
Be careful, Thorin! I know how to put fires out,
Thorin said as Bilbo smothered the flames.
You certainly know how to start them as well,
Bilbo said. He leaned over the counter and opened the little vent in the kitchen wall that connected to the surface. He picked up a plate off the shelves and started fanning the smoke towards it. Thorin took advantage of his husband's presence to wrap an arm around him.
Technically, this isn't my fire.
How is it not? Ah, did the buns burn?
Primula asked, running back into the kitchen with her apron full of stores from the pantry.
I think I forgot about...
She caught sight of Bilbo.
Oh!
Bilbo froze, the plate mid-fanning.
Oh,
he replied. Primula, her face slipping back into that coldness she'd worn when Thorin had first seen her this morning, dipped into a curtsy
At your service, Mr. Baggins. How fare you?
Well, I fare well, very well, Bilbo said. And, you?
Quite well, sir,
Primula replied stiffly.
I invited Primula for lunch,
Thorin said into the strained kitchen air. Bilbo glanced down at the charred remains in the pan.
I see.
He seemed to remember that he was still holding up the plate. He put it down and clasped his hands behind him.
Well, then, I shan't interrupt you any more. Miss Brandybuck, always a pleasure to—
You're joining us,
Thorin added.
He doesn't have to,
Primula started.
but he would like to.
Thorin looked at Bilbo pointedly. Thorin always forgot what it felt like to be annoyed at his husband when he wasn't actively annoyed at his husband. He was remembering now. Bilbo gave Thorin a confused look and then glanced at Primula, whose mouth was a straight line. Bilbo sighed.
Well, I am glad to see you.
He smiled at Primula, and if it was a tired smile, at least it seemed genuine.
Why don't you two let me finish preparing lunch?
That sounds wonderful,
Thorin said.
Doesn't it, Primula?
Primula's eyes were like flint.
I don't want to impose,
she said coldly as she started to unload the food from her apron onto the counter.
And it ain't for your sake, Mr. Baggins, so much as mine.
She raised her chin.
I don't enjoy being where I'm not wanted.
But didn't Thorin invite you? Bilbo asked, with what Thorin had to say was an uncharacteristic stupidity.
Yes,
Primula said.
Thorin did.
Bilbo kept staring at her.
Really?
Thorin asked Bilbo.
Really what?
Bilbo replied, absolutely baffled. Primula crossed her arms.
Bilbo Baggins, after 4 weeks of waiting to hear how you were doing and if you were okay, and whether your husband returning was everything you hoped, after waiting for you to remember that I lived in your home and sat by your side all through the winter because I thought we were, well, I can't believe that it is Thorin who ends up inviting me back to Bag End.
Bilbo continued his staring.
I don't...
And then, and much to Thorin's horror, Primula burst into tears.
Oh dear,
said Bilbo, rushing forward, his hands fluttering before settling on Primula's shoulders.
My dear Primula, I didn't realize. That is to say, I have been... Oh, please stop crying. I've been a bit of a fool.
Bilbo pulled Primula into a hug, the same way that someone who has never danced before might attempt a waltz. Over her shoulder, patting her back like sadness was something one could dislodge like a babe's burp. Bilbo stared imploring at Thorin. Thorin shrugged helplessly back.
There.
Primula pulled away, her cheeks wet underneath eyes that still looked like they could have been dwarven carved, and punched Bilbo in the arm.
Oh!
Bilbo squawked, indignant and undignified, which was really the only way you could squawk.
I'll say you've been a fool, Mr. Baggins,
Primula said.
And from you, of all people.
Bilbo rubbed his arm.
I feel bad for Lobelia now,
he muttered.
Dwalin taught you bad habits.
Primula put her fists on her hips and glared at him.
After all Mr. Oakenshield put you through, I wouldn't have thought you'd be so callous as to leave without a note.
Bilbo snorted. You should know better than anyone that I haven't left, he said, with a bitterness that surprised Thorin. I can't go anywhere.
You know, at least Deers and Dwalin and Toriel had an excuse. They left the Shire. You're still right here. You'd think it'd be harder to leave people without leaving, but I see you're clever enough to manage it.
Primula shook her head. Silence followed. Bilbo's face went still and small.
People come into your life and then they leave,
Primula said, almost to herself.
I just think that's sad, is all.
Oh dear,
Bilbo said eventually.
I just thought that after all this time, you and Drogo were quite sick of me.
Fool,
Primula said plainly.
How would we ever be sick of you?
When Thorin was still getting used to the idea of his nephew yoking his life to an elf, what finally made him love Tauriel was seeing how clearly she loved Kili. He hadn't known before that you could love someone simply because they loved someone else. Thorin was glad he'd learned that before this moment. Otherwise, he would have had a very hard time identifying what it was that he was feeling. And since it was now Bilbo's turn to be without words, Thorin stepped forward and said,
Come, we can berate my husband over lunch.
He glanced in the pan.
I think the buns are still salvageable. Nonsense,
Bilbo said instantly.
Nonsense! I'll make something new. Well, with Drogo not here, I'll finally have the chance to cook for you. In fact,
Bilbo added, wringing his hands,
I ought to properly cook for the both of you. If Drogo can restrain himself from the kitchen while he's in Bag End. Do you like lamb? And, are you free tomorrow evening? And is he?
Primula laughed and looked again her age, this time in the brightest sense of youth.
Yes to all three, Mr. Baggins. And if he's not free, I'll make sure he is.
For the record,
Thorin said far later that evening, after Primula was fed and stories were shared, and promises were made that they would get together again soon.
I do want to remind you that I did leave a note. Primula is the one who said it, not me.
Bilbo handed Thorin another plate to dry and yawned.
Good heavens! Is it really 8? I'm exhausted. I might go to bed early. Bilbo Baggins in bed at a reasonable hour.
Thorin pressed his hand against Bilbo's forehead.
Are you sick again?
Bilbo laughed and batted Thorin's hand away.
Just tired. I don't normally have guests at Bag End. 5 people lived with you through the winter, including Primula. Those are roommates, not guests. Very different things. Roommates clean up after themselves, and when they eat your food, you get to yell at them.
Bilbo thought for a moment.
We did have Bjorn as well. I always forget about him. But he lived in the garden. He was less of a guest and more of a wild animal we kept giving food to.
Thorin grinned.
Are you saying that I was your last guest?
Bilbo shook his head.
You and your dozen other miscreants, yes. Although, on reflection, I might put the company in the same category of Bjorn.
You did invite us in.
Nonsense! I was raided, brutally impressed into service, and then thoughtlessly abandoned.
Bilbo handed Thorin the pot he had been scrubbing.
It was a very emotional evening.
That it was,
Thorin said, making sure his fingers touched Bilbo's as he took the pot.
Don't smile like that, you old softy.
Smile like what?
Like you're thinking about how we fell in love that evening, which I'll remind you was not the case.
But I did fall in love with you that evening. It simply took time for me to realize it.
You utter sap, said Bilbo. You didn't think you loved me. You thought I was a useless burden that Gandalf was foisting upon you.
I'm a very clever dwarf. I can think two things at once.
Bilbo flicked dishwater at him. Thorin swatted his husband with the towel.
This is perfect,
Thorin thought as Bilbo laughed again.
This is why I came here.
So you are out of practice with receiving guests in Bag End,
said Thorin cheerfully.
We'll have to get you in practice. I have the whole of the Shire to meet, and no better place to meet them than in our home.
Bilbo, still smiling, shook his head.
And invite the spies of the neighborhood to snoop through our lives? No, we'll restrict the invitation list to Primula and Drogo. They've already done all the snooping they could please.
I have it on good authority that we'll have to invite people over sooner or later,
Thorin said, starting to dry again.
Rothbert says, Rothbert! Yes, your childhood nemesis informs me that we're expected to return any invitations we receive. And I must get on it. I've half a dozen teas with Dwalin's brigade of old ladies that I need to repay already.
Bilbo waved off the idea of politeness and mutual hospitality like it was a gnat.
You hardly need to reciprocate the attentions of hobbits who wished to gawk at you.
The pot was beyond dry at this point, but Bilbo was still tackling the gristle of the pan, and so if Thorin put aside what he now held, he would have nothing to look at except his husband. So Thorin kept drying the pot.
They do not gawk,
Thorin said in a measured voice.
Your neighbours have been very polite.
I imagine they were, Bilbo replied. They are until you're gone, and then they methodically dissect you for their edification and entertainment. They need to know where you belong, after all, even if it's clear you will never belong.
I know I'm an oddity. I don't mind if they think of me as such, so long as they are friendly about it. From the way you talk about your neighbours, I expected them to be barely literate bigots, constantly brandishing pitchforks. They have been nothing of the sort.
Don't defend my people to me. I know them, Thorin. I am them.
You have defended dwarves 1,000 times to outsiders.
Thorin tossed down the towel on the counter.
Should I not return the favour?
Bilbo kept his hands in the grey water, his sleeves rolled up, and his hair flopping forward into his eyes.
I don't like guests in my home, he said eventually. Primula doesn't live here now, so she is a guest. She is a necessary guest, but still a guest."
"Do you not like her?"
Bilbo's stone face softened, or maybe it weathered, the way the oldest statues along the parapet of Erebor weathered, until the sternest brows turned sad.
"Of course I like her,"
Bilbo said wearily.
"I like Drogo as well. He's certainly my favourite relative, and not just by process of elimination. It's tiring liking them, and I'm a truly lazy hobbit when I'm allowed to get away with it. I'm lazy, and I'm cold, and I'm a horrible recluse. I know that."
Bilbo sighed.
"Yes, I like them. The thought that Primula will become a Baggins someday, if we're lucky enough that they do marry, is one of the finest things that could happen to our sorry family. We could use that brandy-buck grit."
"I never thought you were lacking in grit,"
Thorin said softly. Bilbo shot him a wry look, which was an improvement from the tersely irritated one he'd been wearing before.
"You thought I was lacking in grit until we were on the far side of the Misty Mountains, Thorin Oakenshield. And in any case, the Baggins family is a very floppy, mealy one when we're undiluted."
Bilbo handed Thorin the pan he had been worrying as they spoke. It was scrubbed pristine.
"We're very boring, left to our own devices."
"Romantic sap or not," Thorin said, "I don't believe you've ever been boring."
"That's the took part you're talking to."
Bilbo spread his water-wrinkled hands.
"And since Bag End is endowed upon the Baggins line, I'm afraid the took part doesn't live here."
Thorin turned around and leaned back against the counter.
"I'm talking to Bilbo, who is, last I checked, just the one hobbit, not two stitched together, taking turns at decision-making based on their family lineages."
Bilbo snorted.
"Maybe an Erebor. I'm afraid everyone around here is a horrific chimera of the people they come from. We take our inheritance very seriously, and we never throw out anything."
There was a little dish by the sink where Bilbo and Thorin put their rings while they washed. Thorin reached over and picked up his.
"I know something of family inheritance."
Bilbo watched Thorin finger his grandfather's ring, and then held out his own hand. Thorin slid Bilbo's ring, the simple band that Thorin had crafted himself, back onto Bilbo's finger.
"I don't dispute it."
Bilbo took his hand back and began toweling it dry.
"But I think perhaps it is different for us, your legacy being the greater but the singular, and mine split so thoroughly down two modest footpaths heading in entirely separate directions."
Thorin raised an eyebrow.
"Are you saying it is easier to be a son of the line of Durin than to be both a Baggins and a Took?"
"Oh, no, not easier," Bilbo demurred. "I'm saying yours is a death by drowning in the massive crush of your unerring destiny, while mine is to be from being stretched on the rack."
Thorin laughed.
"Well put. Maybe I should have spilled all my troubles to you in Erebor. You put it into words so well."
Bilbo's face had a neat trick. It could look like Bilbo had just taken a step away from you, without moving at all.
"Yes, that's the reason why."
"Bilbo, that is the only only reason why you should have confided your troubles to me."
Thorin didn't want to be annoyed, but he was. He very much was, not the least of which because Thorin's discontent in Erebor was Thorin's problem, and therefore there was no one more qualified to make jokes about it than Thorin. So if Bilbo would like to get that cold little snippy voice now because Thorin deigned to mention that time, Thorin took a breath to calm himself.
"You are one to talk."
The breath apparently had not worked. Bilbo cocked his head.
What does that mean?
"You have hardly been forthcoming yourself,"
Thorin said. Bilbo rolled his eyes and turned his back on Thorin, resting his hands on the counter. Thorin narrowed his eyes at the juts of Bilbo's shoulder blades and took another breath. It worked about as well as the last one.
"And your lies of omission are not in the past. For the weeks that I have been here, you have not been yourself."
Bilbo stiffened. Thorin stepped forward.
"Every time I ask you what's wrong, you say that you are fine. You retreat from me into your library. You retreat from your friends into your house. And I make excuses for you when I go into town. I pledge your case to Primula today, but I don't know what's going on."
Bilbo whirled around, his face pale with rage. Thorin staggered back in shock.
"You know!"
Bilbo hissed. He drew in a ragged breath.
"You know! I told you!"
The kitchen was silent. Water in the sink dripped. Outside, the wind picked up and the shutters beat against the walls. Bilbo ran his hands through his hair and did not look at Thorin.
"And I am myself,"
he said, his voice quieter but no softer.
"This is who I am. If you ever thought otherwise, that is because you did not know me in my own soil."
"That's not true," Thorin said. "The same Hobbit I loved in Erebor stands before me now, and I still love him now. Even if I now understand, half the village keeps warning me not to."
Bilbo scoffed, and pure irritation shot up from Thorin's churning gut.
"I am returning the invitations I have received. You don't have to join me when our guests come, but you should."
"Why?" asked Bilbo caustically, as he picked up the dish towel once more, scrubbing the last of the water from his fingers.
"Because to not would be rude?"
"No,"
Thorin snapped.
"Because it's hurtful. Because these people open their homes to us, and then you snub them."
"I'm sorry if they get their feelings hurt because they cluttered my mailbox with invitations. Just because they make a claim on my time and home doesn't mean they're entitled to it."
"Our time, our home. Isn't that what you said? Or am I an unwanted guest in your home as well?"
Thorin held out his hands and waited for Bilbo's answer. Bilbo did not deign to give him one.
"I'll invite them over myself."
Bilbo's look was ice cold as he wrung the towel around his hands. Unfortunately, Thorin was feeling red hot.
"We both live here now,"
Thorin said.
"Bully for us,"
Bilbo spat. He slapped the towel down on the counter and stalked away. Thorin clenched his fists and watched him go. When Bilbo reached the door, he paused. He almost looked back. Thorin almost apologized. The problem was, Thorin wasn't sure exactly what he would apologize for.
"We had 2 bedrooms back home in Erebor,"
Bilbo said, without turning around.
"Why don't we try that again tonight?"
He waited for an answer. When he realized he would not get one, Bilbo shook his head once more and left. Thorin heard the pounding of his footsteps marching away. The library door opened once more. This time, when it shut, the sound of its lock echoed down the silent hallway. After a very, very long moment, Thorin unclenched his shaking hands. He turned to the sink, the last dishes still waiting for them. Not knowing what else to do, Thorin picked up the rag and finished the wash.
"Do you plan on closing your eyes at any point tonight?"
Bilbo asked. The candles were burnt out. What lit the bedroom now was starshine. Silver never seemed so warm as when it hugged Bilbo. The light was as alive as Thorin's love. Bilbo's eyes were bowed with sleep, and moonlight hung on his brows. Thorin had never seen this view of his husband, not in all their years. They had not shared a bedroll when they had been on the quest, and in Erebor there was no moonlight to cling lovingly to any warm cheeks. The closest Thorin had seen was Bilbo in repose in hospital, when illness and the skylight turned the evening sky into Bilbo's shroud.
No, I think I'll stare at you a while longer."
"Oh?"
"Until I die, which is to be years and years and years before you."
Bilbo reached out for Thorin's hand.
"Oh, sure, shift the grief my way, then. I did my share."
Oh, you utter nonce. Have you forgotten Ravenhill?" Bilbo's lips pressed to Thorin's palm.
"I saw you die there. If anything, it was your turn to watch me."
"You knew I was still alive within the hour," Thorin protested, his fingers curling against Bilbo's cheek.
"I, on the other hand, had to spend the longest winter of my life waiting to know if you had died."
"Are you trying to argue that your death and resurrection was less emotional than mine?"
"I'm simply suggesting that if you had not tarried so long in illness—"
"Tarried?"
"Some of us are simply more efficient than others."
Bilbo snorted, a laugh with a little censure hiding at the edges.
"That's the most ridiculous tripe I've ever heard in my life, my dear husband." "Then you haven't listened to some of the things you yourself have said, my dear burglar."
"I am intolerably treated by the one I love."
"I'll take no blame," said Thorin. "I learned to love from you."
There was nothing in Erebor that gleamed so beautifully as Bilbo's eyes. There was nothing in Erebor that sounded so sweet as Bilbo's laugh. There was nothing in Erebor that held so firm as Bilbo's hand. There was nothing that Thorin had left behind that could compare to what lay ahead.
Well,
Bilbo said softly,
I suppose that explains that, doesn't it?
Thorin could not remember ever before being so sleepy. Tired, yes, and weary, and bone-aching, all things he knew. But sleepy? Like this, like Thorin was falling backwards without moving, like the bed underneath him managed to cradle a body that curled like a dense star, like the world, in fact, was just this bed and this hobbit looking at him with moonlight eyes, and the heavy, heavy infinitude of sleep folding over Thorin, like lava pouring forth, and the knowledge that he would not be burned nor buried, but swaddled if he would merely let sleep swaddle him. And there was no reason not to, because nothing waited for him on the other side of night, but pleasure, but love, but leisure, but rest, but Bilbo. A sleepiness like that, it was very new. Thorin, too sleepy to possibly utter any of this, simply hummed. Bilbo's fingers ghosted over Thorin's cheeks. He could not manage the energy to speak the words, but he could whisper them.
And now you live again. My remarkably inefficient resurrection.
Bilbo chuckled lowly. His laugh was soft. His skin was soft. His bed was soft. His world was soft. Thorin had never felt sleepier. It was a bit like being buried alive, but in the nicest way.
Imagine the looks on their faces when they see me again.
The feeling that followed was a bit like being buried alive, but in the normal way. It was a bit like falling backwards, too. Thorin's stomach lurched accordingly.
When they see you again?
Yes, well, yes. I've been thinking about it, Thorin.
Bilbo sat up in bed. Sleep shook loose, and excitement like a volt running through him. Thorin, also not nearly as sleepy as he was a moment ago, drew back his hand for fear of electrocution.
I was talking to, well, astonishingly enough, it was Lobelia who made me really think of it. But I wasn't sick for a long time, was I? 5 years before I noticed anything. 6 years before, well, you know.
That is not a long time,
Thorin said carefully. Bilbo waved that off with a laugh, one that Thorin did not find so sweet-sounding as the ones that had come before.
For a dwarf, maybe, but for a hobbit, that's a good chunk. And I really do think, that I could be away from the Shire even longer. Primula and I have been thinking about it, about my illness, about what it means. We've half the librarians in the Shire pulling anything with a reference to hobbits that wander too far from home. And once we've used your raven to tell Erebor that you're here, safe and alive, I thought we could send him to Rivendell. The elves know something, or they may not, but Thranduil was the one who knew about the cause of my sickness, so they likely know more about the magic of the land than us. And Primula isn't even sure that it's magic, necessarily. Or as she puts it, anything's magic if you haven't thought about it enough. Maybe there's a food that only grows in the Shire that has some nutrient that my body desperately needs. Or maybe there's spores around here that I'm adapted to and don't grow anywhere else. Or maybe it really is just magic, but that doesn't mean we can't work with it. I mean, look at my ring, which, did you bring it with you?
Thorin shook his head silently. Bilbo sighed.
Oh, that's a shame. That's very much a shame. I would love to hold it again. But then again, I can just grab it myself.
Thorin rolled over on his back. The ceiling of Bilbo's room had some very nice crown molding. What a lovely detail! Thorin would have to study it closer in the morning.
From Erebor.
Yes, silly, of course from Erebor. Bilbo rose to his knees. He looked almost as if he were in prayer, or as if he had bested Thorin in combat and knelt now for the killing blow.
You gave up everything for me, Bilbo said quietly. I want to give Erebor back.
Thorin slowly, incredulously, shook his head.
Bilbo, you cannot possibly return.
And I am telling you that possibly I can. We can, Thorin. You needn't.
It's insanity.
Bilbo waved that off with the breeze of a hobbit who has never had to doubt his sanity.
Oh, it might involve some risk. It's a death sentence.
Something passed over Bilbo's face that Thorin didn't understand.
There are different types of... Listen, I am healthier now than I was when I left the first time. I am stronger, I am fitter. I've spent the last weeks doing nothing but wandering the Shire and sleeping outside. So I can assure you that I'm ready for travel. And the problems of the first journey won't be nearly so dire. The elves of Rivendell will welcome and replenish us. The Misty Mountains lost most of their goblin forces in the war, so it will be no great difficulty for 2 travellers to go undetected. Bjorn promised me when he was here that we would be welcome in his home. Or at least he'd let us stay there without much grumbling, so that's an option. And Mirkwood! Your nephew has mapped it all. Your niece helps command it. In Dale, we will meet our old friends, and I'll see how tall Tilda has grown.
Bilbo grabbed at Thorin's hand, and Thorin let him grab it, let his hand be grasped and moved as Thorin shut his eyes.
We can do this, Thorin. We can go home. You said this was our home.
Yes, Bilbo faltered. Thorin sat up as well.
You can't live in Erebor. It will kill you.
We'll work around that.
We can't. What happens then?
Then?
Then we come back to the Shire, and you recover, and then we leave for Erebor again.
Oh, you don't have to come with me if you don't want to.
Of course I'd come with you. Do you want me to not?
No, said Bilbo with a sigh. He sounded smaller.
But, Thorin, so we'd live here waiting to see when we could go back to there, and we'd live there waiting to see when we must come back here, and the rest of the time we live nowhere, trying to get to the next place that we're going to leave.
Bilbo had no answer.
I lived my life in exile, Thorin said. Do you remember that?
Of course I remember that, Bilbo said. As I recall, you were in exile from Erebor. I thought you would want to return, and I know they want you back. Thorin, everyone is so worried about you. Guilt was a physical thing, a rock that sat in the bottom of Thorin's stomach. And shame was the fist around his throat that kept him from vomiting it up. Rage was nothing, just a fire, a burn, hardly anything compared to the other two. The part of Thorin that had pulled him back from gold sickness knew this, knew the intoxication of anger because anger hurt less. The rest of Thorin was just angry.
Do you think that I am so weak and selfish that I do not wish to return to Erebor? Thorin rumbled. Do you think that I want to cast aside my people, my land, everything that I worked for all my life?
Yes, said a little voice inside Thorin, before the fist closed around it and snuffed it out.
Then we'll go back, Bilbo cried. We cannot! There is no going back. There is no here and there. There is no new permanent exile. Erebor is reclaimed. Philly is king. I died as I ought to have died, and they will continue on fine without me.
Thorin almost reached for Bilbo, but he didn't. Not when he was angry like this. Not even when all he wanted was to hold his husband's hand and make him understand. Because once upon a time the king was a wicked one. And though Thorin would not have blamed Bilbo, Thorin could not endure seeing him flinch away.
This is not exile,
Thorin said instead.
This is retirement.
Bilbo shivered once in the summer wind, slithering through the window.
They would be overjoyed to see you back again. All they would care about is that you were okay. No one would blame you for...
It was very difficult ending a fight in bed with dignity, but Thorin thought he mustered as much of it as he could when he flopped backwards and pulled the blankets up to his chin. Bilbo fell silent.
We live here now,
Thorin said, half into the pillow.
I gave up Erebor for you, and I am happy with the bargain. We won't discuss this again.
Bilbo did not lie down.
I didn't want you to give up your home forever for me. And furthermore, I don't believe you have to. What you believe doesn't...
Thorin cut himself off. He stared off at the empty side of his bed. No table, no flowers, no books yet waiting for him at night.
Let's go to sleep.
Behind him, the bed shifted. Bilbo did not get under the covers with him, but he moved so that his back leaned against the headboard.
And then we'll discuss this further in the morning?
Thorin squeezed his eyes shut.
No. If you love me, you won't discuss this with me again.
He pressed his face against the pillow and willed himself to feel its impossible softness again.
We live here now.
Bilbo was silent for so long that someone who didn't know him might think that the conversation was over. Thorin, in stillness and without calling it waiting, waited.
And what if I did not wish to live my life, trapped in the home I ran away from?
Bilbo whispered, his voice cold as starlight. Thorin said nothing. He feigned sleep, and knew that Bilbo knew it was feigned, and thought him the rankest coward for it. Bilbo was not wrong. Thorin would not be here if he was not a coward. Thorin feigned sleep until the weariness returned, as it always did, and surrendering himself to a coward's reprieve, Thorin feigned no longer. He woke some hours later to feel Bilbo pressing against his back, Bilbo's arms around his waist, Bilbo's face pressed between his shoulders. Thorin held his husband's hands and wept for the second time tonight. Dwalin said that Thorin was wretched without a quest. Dwalin was right. So here was the quest. Thorin would be happy in the Shire. He had lost Erebor, no matter what Bilbo in his courage believed. But here Thorin would be stronger than misery. Thorin would never need to worry about Bilbo. Bilbo would never need to worry about Thorin. They would be so happy here at last without Thorin. Rudeness, gold sickness, weakness, unhappiness, unworthiness, every ness you could pile on and then some, flaws beyond enumeration, vice without end, once more dragging them down. Thorin brought his husband's hands to his lips and kissed his vow against them.
We will be happy here. I will give you the life you deserve. I will be enough to make you happy here.
To be continued in Chapter 11.
Thank you for reading.
Please drop by the archive
and let the author know what you thought of their work.